Hello, I'm Iain Donald. I'm a senior lecturer at Abertay University. My research examines the intersection of games and history with a focus on collective and communal memory, with a specific reference to communities impacted by war, the veterans who fought in them, and considering how we represent conflict in virtual worlds. My co-authors are Nick Webber and Esther Wright. Nick is an associate professor in media at Birmingham City University. Nick's research focuses on games, cultural history and identity, and explores the historical practices of player communities, as well as the concept of national culture in video games and cultural policy. Esther is a lecturer in digital history at Cardiff University. Esther researches representations of US history in video games and their promotional materials, with a particular focus on Rockstar Games. Her paper is entitled Video Games, Historical Representation and Soft Power, and explores how historical video games have become tools for both UK, Western and Chinese soft power or public diplomacy, and the role of historical representation in portraying cultural identity in the global marketplace. Joseph Nye coined the term soft power in the 1980s. As Nye defined it, hard power was the ability to get others to act in ways that are contrary to their initial preferences and strategies, through coercion, threats or inducement. In contrast, soft power was the ability to get others to want the outcomes that you want, the ability to achieve goals through attraction rather than coercion. A prime example of soft power is cultural diplomacy, the ability to persuade others through culture, values and ideas. Cynthia Schneider defined public diplomacy as all a nation does to explain itself to the world, and elaborated that for public diplomacy to achieve its goals, cultural diplomacy supplied much of the content. Today, that content is represented through film, television, music, social media and video games. Though perhaps not as publicly identifiable and as overt as film or social media, the continued growth of the games industry has ensured that games have become tools that governments desire to use for the same purpose as other media. We ask what effect state interventions have on historical representation in and around video games, and how this representation can be put to work in the service of soft power. In addition, we consider how the combination of ownership that crosses regulatory contexts with pressures to make games internationally consumable shapes historical discourse in these spaces. Games are frequently cited as bigger than Hollywood, and certainly in regard to revenue, games far outstrip both box office revenue and the recorded music industry. In 2021, games revenues were estimated at some $180 billion, enjoying a year-on-year growth of more than 10%, and up from $165 billion in 2020. In contrast, the best year ever for global box office revenues was 2019, with approximately $39 billion. Though that has obviously been impacted by the pandemic, revenue for the recorded music industry was estimated at $21.5 billion in 2019 and $23.1 billion in 2020. None of this tells the full story, but even factoring in available information on the increasing consumption of movies and television at home, then it is estimated that the global entertainment industry, that is theatrical and home movie or TV entertainment, turned over approximately $100 billion in 2020. There remains a considerable gap between games and other screen media, and this market dominance has ensured that video games are now key areas for government support and intervention. It is worth noting that the relationship between the gaming industry and that of film and television has also started to shift. For many years, the sign of a successful film was the development of a video game. We have now entered an era where films and television series are being developed from successful games. 2016, the film of the game World of Warcraft was released. 2017 saw the release of Angry Birds and Assassin's Creed movies, and in 2019 Netflix launched the series of The Witcher. As a cultural medium, games are now influencing other media. This growth has been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic, as widespread national lockdowns curtailed live events and person-to-person contact for other creative industries. The closure of both movie theatres and film sets impacted the development of content at the same time as games and virtual spaces accelerated as surrogate social and cultural hubs. As games have come to be regarded as big business, they have also become culturally important to states and other actors in international politics. State efforts and financial support are not confined to the building of regional hubs or to attracting and retaining technically skilled workforces, though these are important. States are increasingly using video games to promote cultural heritage, even as older games become cultural heritage themselves, and are interested in ensuring that they can influence the type of content that is being made. For the United Kingdom and China, that has involved different processes and measures, but both with a similar overall aim. In the United Kingdom, the drive to promote games as a growth sector and successful British export has led to video game tax relief measures being introduced in 2014. The sector received further recognition by being identified as a key part of the UK industrial strategy in 2017. Today, developers can qualify for significant tax relief if their game passes a points-based cultural test, which includes the allocation of specific points for games which contribute to or reflect British cultural heritage. The test itself has a relatively low points threshold and is deemed to pass if it is awarded 16 points out of a possible 31. Points are awarded based on British or European Economic Area content. This includes the game setting, the lead characters and the subject matter, but also includes points for the perceived cultural contribution, use of cultural hubs and key personnel. There are specific rules to ensure that games with an undetermined setting can potentially qualify, and others to ensure that the development is led by a UK-based developer. One example is Rockstar Games. Rockstar Games is headquartered in New York and owned by the publisher Take-Two, also based in New York, but routinely qualifies for video game tax relief as it has a significant number of UK-based subsidiaries: Rockstar London, Rockstar North, Rockstar Leeds, Rockstar Lincoln and Rockstar Dundee. These subsidiaries have led or contributed to the development of some of gaming's largest franchises, the Grand Theft Auto series and Red Dead Redemption series. They have qualified for considerable support. The UK-based think tank TaxWatch estimated that Rockstar had claimed approximately £80 million in video game tax relief by mid-2019. Although there is warranted cynicism about the extent to which such interventions are about anything more cultural than differentiation in the global marketplace, there is an expectation that the games that qualify not only represent British culture, but by doing so conduct cultural diplomacy. So how do game franchises such as GTA and Red Dead Redemption, both set in America, qualify as culturally British? It is worth emphasising that Rockstar are not the only game developer that qualify. Video game tax relief has flowed to a range of recognisably British game makers, such as Creative Assembly, subsidiary of Sega, famous for the Total War series, Sports Interactive, also a subsidiary of Sega, famous for the Football Manager series, Traveller's Tales, subsidiary of Warner Brothers Interactive, known for the Lego series of video games, and Media Molecule, a subsidiary of Sony and famous for the Little Big Planet series. Multiple smaller and independent companies have also benefited, but these larger companies with established franchises are the most recognisable beneficiaries of video game tax relief. They represent products produced for a global marketplace and are often the sum of a global effort. The game, platforms, publisher, developer and subsidiaries working together to produce games that sell in the several, if not tens of millions. However, they also represent the difficulties and challenges of layered relationships and development of soft power. If we just consider the complex relationships of either the Creative Assembly or Rockstar Games, they are both internationally renowned for games with extensive historical context, both within the games themselves and in a range of paratextual or ancillary materials. Yet both are UK subsidiaries of non-UK based companies. Both are involved in developing games that are at the forefront of historical representation, either through the Total War series or Red Dead Redemption series. Both are receiving video game tax relief for making culturally British games. These companies have therefore attracted criticism of the scheme. Initial estimates placed the video game tax relief at costing approximately £35 million. But since 2019 this has exceeded £100 million. Much of the criticism is levelled at the fact that since the scheme launched, almost half of all the tax relief has been claimed by Rockstar and the three other large multinational corporations: Sony, Sega, Warner Media. That the UK subsidiaries are making or leading on the making of games that qualify as culturally British, but are owned by companies headquartered outside of the UK, is undoubtedly going to raise questions on what qualifies as culturally British. The BFI in their guidance explicitly identified Total War Napoleon as a video game which tells the story of a British historical event but which might not necessarily be set in the UK. They were regarded as qualifying because the subject is an important part of the unique British heritage, and video games can play an important role in ensuring that they remain relevant to modern society, for instance by reaching a new, younger audience. Although a similar argument can be made for Red Dead Redemption and its depiction of the American West at the end of the 19th century, it becomes more tenuous, and if the rules or guidance were to shift, it is possible to see how a game becomes disqualified. Here then, explicit cultural policy in support of video games becomes implicit cultural policy shaping historical discourse, in an ideologically specific British or more generally Western mould. In China, public diplomacy has also been at the heart of the national promotion strategy under Xi Jinping, summarised by the idea of telling China's stories well or telling a good story of China, alongside the notion of the Chinese dream. These initiatives build on China's previous adoption of established international models of development in the cultural sector, for example the introduction in the mid-2000s of the creative industries approach. The outcomes of these approaches are visible in the extensive presence of Chinese television on streaming platforms and in hugely successful games companies such as Tencent and NetEase. With that said, there continues to be deep-seated wariness of the video game medium. In August 2021, an editorial in state media outlet Economic Information Daily branded online games spiritual opium. Since then, tighter restrictions on the amount of time children can spend playing games have been introduced, along with measures to increase inspections of online gaming companies to ensure that the time limits are being enforced. The stricter additional regulatory environment is bringing into sharp contrast games that are made that reflect upon China's history and cultural heritage. For example, in 2015, Tencent released Honor of Kings, a multiplayer online battle arena game, or MOBA. The game was released internationally under the name Arena Valor 2 years later, in 2017. Influenced by the hugely successful League of Legends developed by Riot Games, which Tencent acquired in 2011, the game has proved very popular and became the top grossing game in China in 2016 and internationally in 2017. That popularity has endured and the game was the top grossing again as recently as February 2022. Other scholars, such as Laborious and Martin, have analysed the game's usage of historical characters and the ensuing debate and criticism as popular heritage. We are highlighting the game as an example of the tension that exists between economic competitiveness and state-led requirements to avoid historical nihilism. To that end, China's approach understands that video games speak inwardly and outwardly, and China is concerned about this representation because it sees games as linked strongly to soft power. There is, of course, substantial evidence that history can be a contentious issue in the space of national media regulation in any case, articulated not only by governments but also through local game communities. In 2013, Company of Heroes 2 was famously withdrawn from sale by its Russian distributor due to public controversy about its representation of the Red Army in World War II. Historical games that have fallen foul of regulatory measures in China in the past include Hearts of Iron for depicting disputed territories such as Tibet and Taiwan as independent nations. Football Manager 2005 was banned for similar reasons. Other games such as Command & Conquer Generals and Battlefield 4 were banned for smearing China's national image or that of the Chinese army. As previously mentioned, games companies such as Tencent have seen their share price being severely impacted as it tried to balance criticism from the state newspaper, the People's Daily, widely regarded as speaking directly for the Chinese Communist Party, with limitations on the amount of time its customers were allowed to play its hugely popular mobile game Honor of Kings. The difficulty for games companies, Chinese or otherwise, is in determining what is likely to be allowed in an era of tightening regulation. The Chinese regulator, the National Press and Publication Administration, has clear rules against copyright infringement and output that might infringe upon state security, but other guidelines are less precise. Creative work in media that endangers social morality or national cultural traditions or promote cults and feudal superstitions can be outright banned, but that's not always the case. Certainly, China has typically maintained a much stricter regulation and management of the gaming industry than Britain. where the PEGI system administered by the VSC Ratings Board has been the main articulation of games regulation since 2012. However, more recent British governmental interventions have taken a specifically nationalist approach to historical work, involving open denouncement of projects critical of the country's colonial past and suggestions that such work may not be funded in future. How this might evolve or impact upon games made in the UK remains to be seen. Games sit in a space that is both core to the UK government's industrial strategy, and the strategy is openly supported as both a key creative industry and growth area, yet games developed in the UK have yet to run up against governmental interests. The development of culturally British historical game with clear reference or critical of the nation's colonial history, or even how modern Britain is interpreted, has yet to be challenged. The games made so far that have benefited from forms of government support, not being obliquely critical of the nation's history, representation, or even governments. There is a question as to what happens if a games company, in receipt of tax relief, presents history, values, or ideas that are unpalatable to that government. What does all of this mean for the nature and status of historical representation in and around video games? While state interventions such as video game tax relief support and shape one set of historical perspectives, the extensive ownership of game makers by companies regulated in China applies distinct and opposing pressures on historical issues, particularly the history of the last 3 centuries. There is an increasing desire for games to be localization ready, but that this exists within an increasingly nationalistic regulatory environment, will it threaten the capacity of games to offer thoughtful and challenging engagements with the past? There is a need for greater consideration of the historical arguments to consider not just in-game content, but to consider how the paratextual material, trailers, supporting websites, marketing material, is presented to avoid regulatory problems. Major developers and publishers may find themselves reshaping and or self-censoring content as they navigate around increasingly complex regulatory frameworks. The question we now have is how effective historical representation, when mobilised to project soft power through video games, is. Increasingly, we are seeing gaming being regarded as more than entertainment, and as a form of art that may function to promote perceived values and a sanctioned and regulated understanding of history and culture. This marks a significant shift in the development of video games, which purport to present history in the global marketplace. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening. If you wish to contact us, our details are now there for you to make a note of. Thank you very much.